So we're here on location in a grocery store where they've kindly agreed to let us look around and try and figure out what sorts of things impact our choices and how our choices shape the environment around us and really the world. So often we think there's really not much to this. If we like GMOs, we should be able to select them, and if we don't, we should be able to avoid them. And so why not just let the consumer decide between the two? Well, let's take an example. So, for example, I might have heard that there are genetically modified potatoes. They're modified in order to try and eliminate browning. So if I wanted to try and avoid those GM potatoes, I might look back here and see this potato and wonder, and might be worried, I don't know whether this is GM or not, because there's nothing here that tells me. Lucky for us, over here we find a group of potatoes that are labeled organic, and at least in the US, when they're labeled organic, we know that they're not GMO. In fact, this whole section over here is full of items that are labeled not GMO. Elsewhere in the store, it can be a little bit more difficult. Where we have items that have been processed or branded, there might not be a lot of selection in terms of what's GMO and what's non-GMO. In particular, when we look through the cereals, a lot of these are going to contain corn in some way, and almost everything is going to have some sort of corn in it, corn syrup or corn meal. And in the US, almost all corn is GMO. What does that mean? Well, it means we're not always going to be able to select exactly what we want. So how does the store decide what they're going to have here? There's a limited amount of shelf space, so they can't meet everybody's desires, but they are trying to respond somewhat to what consumers want. So when I make my choices and I have my preferences, that plays into whether the store decides to put it on the shelf or not. And when there are only small groups of consumers that might want something, their items might not be on the shelf. But it's not only consumer choice and consumer preference that determines what's on the shelf, it's also what producers are supplying. Producers are going to choose to produce the things that make them the most money. So farmers are going to choose seeds that have higher yields, that have a higher output price, and that have lower cost for production. But what's here is not shaped just by producers and consumers, it's also shaped by public policy. So, for example, in the neighboring state, Vermont, it's a rather small state, but they've decided that they're going to label all genetically modified foods. And since they have this policy and the rest of the country doesn't, it makes it so it's a little bit more costly for some food producers to put their products in Vermont. What does it mean? It means they need either to change their labels everywhere or make a specific label for Vermont. Public policy tends to respond to public opinion. So the more people who want to know whether what they're buying is GM or not, the more likely we are to get a policy such as that. Also, the more the public that is averse to GMOs generally, the more likely we are to see GMOs pushed out of the market entirely. So what shapes public opinion about genetically modified foods and whether they're acceptable? Well, there are a bunch of different factors. Some of it might be just looking at our neighbors. Alternatively, we might be influenced by self-interest. If we look, for example, at Europe and the United States, early adoption of crops in genetically modified foods was corn and soybeans. And if you look at the map, the US is the largest exporter of corn and soybeans and the largest producer of corn and soybeans in the world. So they had a lot to gain from the increased yields and from the decrease in cost of production. So we had some bit of self-interest in saying these are acceptable foods. Alternatively, if you look at the EU, well, they import a lot of their corn and soybeans, and they don't produce nearly as much at home. And so they don't have nearly the incentive to do that. Perhaps self-interest helped shape some of those early policies regarding GM foods.